Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our YouTube channel here. Over this last week, we have been talking about A Tale of Two Kings. And recently, we've been going over the first king of Israel, who is King Saul. And he was chosen by God through Samuel to be the king of the Israelites. And so, at the last moment that we were on here, we were talking about how Saul didn't really think that he was going to be king. He just kind of took Samuel's word and was like, okay, and went back to his house and lived at his house until there were some issues that arose in which he had to go and help take care of. And so, and then we have, he kind of rises to the occasion. He begins winning battles and winning people's hearts. And they're like, yes, this is the king that we wanted, instead of having just to serve God. And so that's kind of where we left off. But today the story kind of shifts a little bit to where Saul begins making some mistakes as king, which is to be expected because he's human like us. But it kind of starts making some bad choices.
Yeah, Saul now is now going to run into what is the people who are against the Israelites, those who are around them and end up attacking them in time to time. And one of these people, one of these groups that are close to them are the Philistines. So when Saul sets up what is now him as king and now has his son Jonathan, now they start having what is a military in order to be able to protect themselves and attack the Philistines that cross their lands. But when the Philistines see now Saul and Jonathan as a problem, they decide to bring up a whole army against them. So what happens is that Saul had called out for people to come and join him in order to be able to fight the Philistines. But when the Philistines brought their army all together in front in a place called Gilgal, the people of Israel were afraid and they started running away, hiding in places. They even crossed a river, and some of them even crossed a river to be as far away as possible from this large army of the Philistines. Now, of course, God knew about this and was going to help Saul. But there was a deal that Saul made with Samuel, the prophet, who was the one in charge of communicating what God wanted to Saul and to encourage the people that God was with them, the one who was supposed to make the sacrifices to God and bring essentially him into what is going to be this battle. Samuel said that he would meet up with Saul in Gilgal in 7 days. So they waited 1 day. They waited another day. And if every day that was passing, people were just like, Saul, we can't do this. We need to leave now. So a lot more and more people were deserting the army of Saul. So the seventh day came, and Saul said, okay, you know what? I don't see Samuel anywhere. I am going to do the offerings to God. I am going to be the one to call out to God for his favor over these battles and this confrontation that we were going to have with the Philistines. So he does everything he is not supposed to do, the stuff that Samuel is supposed to do to communicate with God, to seek God's favor. And when he is done doing all of that, Samuel then suddenly appears. And Samuel comes up to Saul and being like, what are you doing? This is what I said I was going to do. Why did you do that? So Saul at that moment starts pointing at every single possible excuse as to the reason why he had to do it at that moment. He talks about, the situation was just really getting hard, and there's the Philistines that we have to worry about. People were starting to desert here and there, and you just weren't showing up. So, I had to do it. And this is where Samuel says, well, this isn't what God wanted. And I warned you that if you disobeyed God, then your whole kingdom is going to fall. You will not be able to be king over the Israels. In fact, because of your disobedience, you act selfishly, you acted without thinking. Now God has sought another person to be king.
And so it ends up being that Saul really took matters into his own hands instead of trying to follow what God had actually wanted. He didn't wait for Samuel to come and present the offering. He just kind of took charge and was like, all right, we're just going to do this my way, since obviously no one else is going to do this. And so this is an example of sin, because we talk often about how when God asks us to do something and we don't do that thing, it's sin. And so this is an example of King Saul sinning against God. And this is a very serious offense because God specifically asked him to wait for Samuel, and he didn't. But when Samuel came and confronted Saul with this sin, because he disobeyed God, Saul didn't own up to it. He didn't say, you know what, you're right, I sinned. Please forgive me. He didn't do any of that. He did instead three things that we typically do when we're confronted with our own sin. Saul blamed. He tried to point the blame to somebody else, and he said, no, you, Samuel, you didn't come at the time that you said you would, and so I did this. And then he tried to excuse his behavior, trying to be like, oh, well, we needed to do this because our armies, they were disappearing, and we needed an army to fight this battle. And then he did a final thing, which he tries to justify his behavior, where he was basically saying, I have a good reason for sinning against God, and my reason is I was compelled to do the burnt offering because God needed the offering. And so none of these excuses and blame and justifications that Saul gave, while they may have been true, it doesn't make what his sin was better. It doesn't make it so that he was right with God again. In fact, it makes him further from God because he didn't confess his sin straight out. He tried to point out to everything else except for himself of what was wrong with the situation. And so there's a lesson here for us of when we are confronted with our sin, we have the opportunity to confess our sin. Our job isn't to blame others, or try to excuse why we're doing it, or trying to make it right by justifying the reason why we did it. Because the more so that we try to do that and we don't actually confess our sin and ask for forgiveness, the further that puts us from God. And so when we confess our sins to God, it allows us to fully follow him again instead of just trying to do things our own way. Saul did not do things God's way in this case. He was trying to do it his own way, and he was paying a very high cost for that by knowing that he was not going to be king for very long because God was seeking somebody else to take his place. And while the stakes may not be as high for us, we don't have necessarily kingship that God's going to take away from us. The fact remains that God will seek somebody else to fulfill what we are supposed to be doing if we don't confess our sin. And so we need to make sure that we're not blaming others for our sin or excusing it or justifying it the way Saul did. And we need to confess our sins to God, and so that way we can fully follow him in all that we do. But Saul is still king at this moment, and he's about to make some more mistakes that we'll talk about later on this week, and how that affects us today. And so we'll talk about that more on Saturday, and we'll see ya.
See ya.